Okay, so thanks for your time.
Yeah.
The first thing I guess I wanted to ask was the purpose of this trip. What was the purpose of the trip? Where did you go? Who and what facilities did you meet and visit?
So if you look at the rationale or the stimulus, perhaps, for the trip initially, and that is governments around the world are starting to come out with mandates for when, essentially that electric vehicle, new sales of electric vehicles from certain dates have to be mandated. Therefore, combustion engines, new vehicles, can't be purchased, right? That was pretty clumsy language. But so that made us think a lot of ideology floating around electric vehicles, a lot of, dreams, if you like, a bit of fantasy. We thought, we really need to find out what's going on in those economies that are leading this transition. Australia is a long way away from any manufacturer. We're a right-hand drive market, which makes us pretty unattractive. So when governments say, hey, by potentially 2030, the ACTC said 2035, that all new vehicle sales have to be electric, makes us start to think, well, okay, let's get across this and understand what's going to happen. Because obviously lots of businesses out there are reliant on combustion engines. So we, both myself and all of the MTAs across the country and the VACC from Victoria, went on a delegation. We went to the world's leading economy around transition to electric vehicles, Norway. We went to Sweden, who aren't far behind, but they're still behind. We went to the Netherlands. We went to Germany, a couple of different places in Germany, and we went to the UK. And what we did, we met with industry associations there to get insight as to what the industry view was and what government frameworks were and regulation. Regulation's an important part of this. Then we went out and actually went to businesses. We went to dealerships, new vehicle dealerships. We went to independent mechanics. We went to panel beaters. We went to service stations to get a sense of, well, what's the plan look like and what's the impact? And the impact's significant. So the idea, we're finalising a report now. It'll be available in the next couple of days, where we can say to government in Australia, well, we're a long way behind. Australia's vehicle fleet's future is electric, there's no question, because the world's heading this way. A couple of different versions of electric, which I'll come to. But whilst we're far behind, we can catch up, and quickly, but it's going to cost you money.
One thing I sort of picked up from this, because we're behind in almost all facets of this transition, it's actually useful for the transition coming, because we're observing the problems, the hurdles, and everything that these more developed, in this sense, nations are at. So we're kind of leapfrogging hurdles that they've already encountered.
That's absolutely right.
That's
the
fair
opportunity for Australia.
Yeah.
We can learn, as long as we do learn and we observe closely. We can see what stimulus worked, what hasn't. We can get the framework stuff right, because infrastructure is going to be really important in a country like Australia. And then you've still got what's going to be a preference barrier around. Australia drives more utes and four-wheel drives than most of the world. We drive long distances, as in recreationally, and we tow. So there'll be parts of the market that electric vehicles will probably never replace. Now that's okay, as long as you can have offsets around carbon emission. So it just has to be clever policy.
Yeah. Of course, having said that it's helpful in a way, at the same time, we're kind of not at the leading the pack, right?
Nope.
We're being reactive rather than proactive.
We're at the other end of the spectrum. We're nowhere near leading. You're right. We're way behind. But we can certainly position ourselves to lead the Asia Pacific very comfortably, and we should. And young people want this transition. They want a zero emission future, and I think we all have to commit to it. It's about what's the adaptation for our businesses that are out there. We don't want, well, in Norway, 20% of small businesses close down because of electric transition. That doesn't have to happen. It's about how you adapt.
You mentioned the young people want this sort of, the next generation want this sort of transition, and they want to be in EVs, and partly I assume that's because of the environmentally friendly nature of
all
EVs.
about that.
All about that.
And there's something cool about them. You know, the tech, people think, these are pretty cool.
So, we mentioned in this document, Norway is a leader in all these fields, but has this green power generation advantage, I think it's referred to. Wind, water turbines, all this sort of stuff. Now, the Queensland government just recently announced a massive wind farm,
solar farms,
pumped hydro facilities, large-scale batteries are going in everywhere, and of course, plenty of solar power. For those that look beyond just the zero-emission quality of a EV, this is important stuff.
It's even more important, I think.
Yeah.
And it's still relevant to the EVs.
Yeah.
And I'll explain why. Let's just look at Norway for a moment. 65% of new vehicle sales in Norway are electric vehicles, right? 65%. That is huge. Sure, only 15% of their fleet overall is electric, 50% in Oslo. You walk around Oslo, it's eerily quiet. Because there's no engine noise. It's really weird. It's bizarre, right? You're sitting on a street in a cafe and there's just no noise. But anyway, so Norway have got their paradox is similar to Australia, because guess how they're funding all of their subsidies? They're subsidising cars by $14,000-15,000 a car, so EVs are cheaper, right? But they're funding it through oil and gas sales. So the paradox with Australia is not dissimilar. We just have to accept that. But what they're finding, because electricity prices are escalating 5 or 6 increases in the last year or so across Europe, what they're finding is the cost benefit electric vehicle, if you're using public charging stations, it's not there, right? It's expensive, so you've got to charge at home, and absolutely, if you can, you've got to be charging off renewable energy. So whether that's solar, wind. So it's actually really important that we get that infrastructure right. Australia's got a great opportunity because we've got a lot of sun and a lot of roof panels, but we've just got to get the infrastructure right in houses so people can charge their vehicles at home and store power at home. So that's when batteries come in. But even Norway, 65% vehicle sales are electric. The next closest is Sweden, which is 20%. That's a huge difference. Norway's got the infrastructure wrong. They accept that they don't have range anxiety anymore. They've got queue anxiety.
Right.
So they all like driving into their cabins. They're obsessed with these cabins in the mountains where they go skiing and stuff. They're a couple of hours out of Oslo. They all go on weekends and things. And if you need charging and you get there and there's 6 cars in front of you, it's a distressing time. So they've learnt that the charging network they put in wasn't powered enough. So they just put in normal chargers, whereas everything, their advice is go straight to the top end supercharge, like rapid chargers. Not all vehicles will accept the full 350 kilowatts, but still set your infrastructure up that way to minimise, that way you're there 15 minutes. And their view is you need banks of 6 to 8 charges every 50 to 75 kilometres. Now that's Norway's view. Now in Australia, you think about that. Wow!
Yeah.
Now that might only happen, that would make sense. Brisbane to Sydney to Melbourne, those high traffic routes. Less so once you get a bit more regional. But Norway's saying that's what they've learnt. They didn't get the infrastructure right. Now if they didn't, no one could have. But the Queensland government's commitment to renewable energy recently, I think, is important in terms of electric vehicles.
Yeah.
And also for producing green hydrogen, because that will also be part of powertrains in 10 years or so, according to BMW.
Oh, okay. So in heavy vehicles mostly?
Well, BMW's view, and we got into their research and development centre.
Yeah.
Apparently that's not very common, so
right.
That's really fantastic. And we saw their hydrogen vehicle cars and where they do the bullet tests of the tanks and what their latest development. Their view, hydrogen cars will be cost competitive in about 10 years' time. And from an infrastructure perspective, way more effective because you can use current gas lines. So they're running robots through current natural gas lines and just making sure they're sealed. And you can, each day can be a different sort of gas. It's bizarre. And it's 2 or 3 minutes to fill your car.
Yeah.
So BMW's view is, electric suits light vehicles more than heavy, and hydrogen suits heavy more than light. But they think that you never invest in one option. So they're genuinely thinking both.
Right. And in terms of, as you touched on there, infrastructure for Australia, massive distances, every 50 to 75 k's sounds like an enormous ask.
It's too much of an ask, you'd think.
Yeah.
So that then brings you back to service stations. Service stations are all located for a reason. So is there an opportunity to exploit that infrastructure, be putting banks in? Like BP are just starting to set up their first electric vehicle stations in Australia, which will be in service station forecourts. They'll put some banks in cities originally, just to start testing the concept. It just makes sense to sort of exploit that infrastructure that's there. Like, I know the shopping centres and all that are pretty convenient as well, but...
So we've touched on this subject at Carmageddon with the service station group, and there was some questions asked around cost of installing this sort of stuff, and in fact the performance of the grid enabled to be able to handle this, and that maybe that's a few years away. Does that still holds? But
I think
this is
so.
a definite direction to move.
Yeah, well, again, this is where government have got a role to play.
Yeah.
It's pretty tough on small businesses to say, I want to put 6 chargers into my service station, but the electrical distributors are saying you've got to pay 600 or 800 grand to upgrade the network. That is a very commonplace, and it's happening in Europe as well. So businesses are probably going to have to contribute to that, but that's a big expense. So I think government rolling out infrastructure will need to think about that. And there's also this question of, without renewables, do we produce enough electricity if suddenly 50% of us are driving electric vehicles and charging at the same time? The answer is potentially not. So we've got some genuine energy discussions to have in Australia.
Regarding vehicle supply into Australia, how far down the road towards what the Europeans are doing do we have to get before this? There's a turn?
2% of vehicle sales in Australia are electric. So we about 20,000 vehicles last year, and it's growing. That's great. 24 million got sold in Europe, and that's where the manufacturers are. So where are they going to? That's where the cars go. So Australia just has to create an environment that attracts them. So BMW, as an example, were not as pessimistic as we expected. They said if Australia shows leadership, Australia gets fuel standards, because we don't have international fuel standards, so that's an inhibitor to some of the top tech cars, and starts establishing infrastructure. That's what they want to see, infrastructure for charging cars. They said they're already selling electric vehicles here at the premium end. At the lower end, they're still too expensive. The vehicles will start to come. The UK is imposing, this will help Australia, the UK are imposing, because they're a manufacturer, manufacturing mandates on their manufacturers. So by 2025, a certain percentage of vehicles that they manufacture have to be electric. By 2030, significant escalation, or there's penalties. They're a right-hand drive market. That's going to help Australia. So we can piggyback off some of this.
Yeah. And in terms of the uptake, as well as getting the supply in, the word around incentives, a luxury car tax, get rid of that, and so on. Is any of that mirrored overseas?
Yeah, so Norway, how they've done it, outside of saying to an electric vehicle owner, you get free tollways, you get free parking, you get lower car registrations and things. They've taken away their VAT, so that's our GST. That does not apply to an electric vehicle. They've taken away import duties. So they've done their incentives through tax relief rather than cash subsidy, right? To the tune of about, for a smaller car, about 14 grand, like a Golf.
Wow.
Which once you apply tax to the combustion engine, no tax to the electric vehicle, it's not only comparable, it's a little bit cheaper. So why wouldn't you buy an electric vehicle? The latest tech, all that sort of stuff. So Australia has to think about that. We don't have to, like government doesn't have to subsidise cars if they want the journey to take a while. If this 2030, I think by 2030 they're saying they want to reduce emissions by 43%. And transport's the second biggest contributor to emissions, 18-19%. If they want, vehicles to play a part, they're just going to have to incentivise it. Sweden's already learnt that as soon as you tweak that incentive, people stop buying them. So, That's the thing. The only time you have to incentivise, I think, if you want to speed up the transition. Because if manufacturers are saying everything's going to be electric, and even though they're saying that, they don't mean it, they'll all... Lots of Asia will be combustion for a long, long time, and they'll be producing cars for them. But so that's our future. So it's just about the speed of transition, and it makes sense to me. Manufacturers tell us at the premium end, people are buying them. You know, if you're going to spend 100 grand, 150 grand on a car,
sure,
you buy an electric. That's fine if you want one. Mm-hmm. But if you look at an SUV, an electric car comparable to a combustion engine at the moment about 30 grand dearer. That's a lot of money.
It is.
If you're going to spend 20 grand on a car versus 50, doesn't matter if you get a $3,000 subsidy.
So we're talking about, I could say short term, but maybe not as we understand it, very short term. Short term incentives to get things rolling. Once they reach a critical mass or beyond, then those incentives come off. So it's not a permanent...
I don't think so. I think it's about getting, once manufacturers think, okay, Australia's now a positive market, start bringing cars here, people are buying them, that's fine. That doesn't get over your Land Cruiser driver versus or a Ute driver. That still doesn't seem to be solved, and that'll take time. Yeah. And there'll be people who tow caravans around the country are probably not going to go electric, so we accept all that. Once you get that marketplace working, government should... governments are better at this than we are, but should start thinking about what that window looks like. But if they don't do it, we're just too far away, too small a market. It's too big a risk for manufacturers. Yeah. And by the way, I think the other opportunity is to put mandatory emission standards onto all vehicles. So if manufacturers are still bringing their combustion engines here, well, that's fine. Put mandatory emission standards on them to make sure we're getting the best cars. Yeah. Right? Be hard on them. I think that's fine. And then you've got the ageing fleet. Lots of people will hang on to their car because they don't want an electric car or can't afford it. So therefore, if you look at New South Wales, after about 6 years, they have to get an inspection of their car every year. That's more about roadworthiness. Sure. If we do something similar to that across the country, but make that about emissions, so get your car tested, make sure people are servicing the car, that will help manage the ageing fleet without all these wins on one side around zero emission cars versus these things belching out too much. Right. So we just need to think about this stuff. Yeah. I apologise that I'm all over the place. No, it's all good.
Well, we'll touch on the auto businesses and how this affects them. So a couple really. So the maintenance and repair servicing sort of sector. So EVs, less service. But what I did, less servicing requirements, no question, and all that. But I did pick up this idea that when EVs do come through, they're very quick to do. So that businesses, service repair businesses, will have to tighten up how they schedule these cars to come through. There's this idea that I've picked up here that there might be parking issues for smaller businesses if you've got...
For all businesses?
Yeah.
So let's deal with the small guys first, like independent mechanics. So you're right, they were saying things like... Because in Europe, their right to repair legislation's far more entrenched, so you've got independent mechanics doing warranty servicing. Like you've got a new car, they come to you anyway, and
MOTs and all that sort of stuff.
That's exactly right. So, but they, it's about 0.9 of an hour for a servicing of an EV. No oil. So you're not making any money on it. There's no margin. The problem for them is they always need software upgrades, and they can only be done through safe portals, which are in the workshops and dealerships. The software upgrades can take 4 to 6 hours. Right? So you've got a bay just sitting there with a car in it. So they're already learning to adapt that they need mechanics working on 4 cars at a time. Right? That's new. And out in the car park, particularly the big dealerships, there's just acres of cars all getting software upgrades. Right? That's an issue. Now, you'd think technology would mean in time that'll be happening at home. Yeah. Through your own Wi-Fi, but not yet because it's highly protected. But what it means is they've got to adapt their business models. Because, we asked the question, well, why bother doing it? Why? And the reason in Europe, what's happening is people have one EV and one combustion car. That's sort of how it's working.
Yeah.
So if you say to them, I'm not going to service the EV, you'll probably lose the combustion one as well. But they're looking at, they now are inspecting windscreens far more diligently. Brakes are an issue for electric vehicles. They wear out more. And remembering in Europe, because of snow, there's a lot of grit on and the like on, and gravel they put on roads, so it gets into the brakes and things like that. So that's something, and tyres wear out a lot more quickly. So independent mechanics are learning to adapt to that. And things like car detailing, they're doing it all part of the package. Because what dealerships are doing, same issue for them. Cars come in, 0.9 of an hour-ish, no money in that, software upgrades. So they're now offering tyre hotels. They're bringing all the stuff that they gave out years ago back in. Tyres, windscreens, car washing, anything that they've handed out is now back in the business.
Interesting, yeah.
And they're buying independent businesses because the used cars that they used to sell them, you drive off the lot, and that's the last time you'd see them because it's too expensive to get it serviced there. Well, they can't afford that now. So they're offering subscription models to say, well, if you just pay $20 a month, you can get your car service here the rest of its life. So you can see dealers are adapting, but independents have to as well.
Yeah.
The winners in this, absolute winners, are the panel and repair shops because people crash EVs more.
That was my next question. Panel repair does not get affected really in any way, right? I mean, they have to adapt to the new technologies and safety and high voltage and all that, but beyond that,
people crash there. They're far more powerful, far heavier, more prevalent for crashing. That's what they're learning. So we went through some of these high-tech workshops, quite remarkable watching them work on it. And, safety's prevalent, so as soon as there's an issue with a car, there's a safety zone outside. They've got to leave the car there till it's been inspected and checked. They don't bring it inside for risk of fire. All get trained. And then the repair process is essentially the same once you decommission the battery.
Right. Okay.
But the real adaptation for business will be dealers, independent mechanics, and all of those other businesses that sit at that currently, windscreen, tyre, the independent tyre shops and things. It's intriguing business.
Well, it's interesting that I was talking to a owner of a tyre shop recently, and he was considering seriously putting in chargers into his...
some of our members are talking about it, yeah.
Yeah, right. I wondered that's repair workshops, that's something that they'll have to put in, right? I mean,
Correct.
If you're working on an EV, you're going to have some way of charging it. So is there a potential there for, say, okay, during the day we're going to use these chargers for working on them, the cars in our shop. Overnight, they're open to the public.
Interesting. That didn't come up, but that's an interesting... Again, that's the sort of innovation that's required, because here's the other thing. If you can't get your car serviced now, never in your wildest dreams will they fill it up with petrol.
Yes.
But electric vehicle owners expect and actually get frustrated if it's not charged when they drive out.
Yes.
So businesses are now doing that at their own cost. So what they're putting in solar panels, right, to try and minimise that. But of course, some of these chargers are pulling serious power.
Sure.
So you're not going to do that solely through solar. So they're looking at batteries and all this other stuff. But yeah, no, I think they will have to put chargers in, and that's interesting to make sure they're positioned outside. And who knows, you can make a buck on the weekend. Or after hours. Yeah.
Well, did you notice the repair workshops? Was there moves to shift to new opportunities that EVs provide? So for like battery repair or changing the batteries or taking out cells and putting new ones in. So
replacing batteries is not considered economical. They're just too expensive.
Right.
These are massive pieces of kit and they're expensive. Some manufacturers are trying to subsidise that if they fail. So warranty on batteries is pretty important.
Yeah.
But no, they can be repaired. That's what they're learning. In Norway, they've learnt that independent mechanics can specialise in unpacking a battery if you can. Not all of them can.
Sure.
Diagnosing the failing cells and replacing them. So they think that's definitely an opportunity. Dealers are saying the same thing, but there is a specialty in this. All of those sorts of things are what will emerge.
Yeah.
And there's still, like ball joints have to be replaced more often apparently, things like that. And what they're finding in terms of skills, I'm going to use the word old, but old mechanics have no interest in going onto the computer and being a high-end learning diagnostic skills around electric vehicles, because these are high-tech vehicles. They're happy to do all the replacing and the breakdowns, but the young people coming through and the apprentices are absolutely on top of it.
Yeah.
So we'll see a new set of skills come through, and we probably can't even, not even in Norway can they quite imagine what that ultimately looks like.
Yeah. But everybody's foreseeing real opportunities for those that can make the leap.
Yeah, no question. Well, yeah, because otherwise you'll manage, like Australia's legacy fleets, the tail's going to be really long with combustion engines. Like, you know, they say 2050, I can't, don't get me wrong, I think these sorts of innovations always happen quicker than you expect. Like, if government get the policy right, this will happen quicker than we expect. Mm-hmm. But there'll be lots of people driving combustion engines for a long time yet.
Yeah.
Hopefully efficient ones, though, if we're trying to, because we do have to accept the importance of reducing emissions.
Sure. I noticed that you went to, I think it was an Audi dealership in Oslo.
Yep.
I was quite intrigued by that because the impression that I got was that it was almost completely focused around EVs, both sales and the servicing.
Yep, it is.
So what was your impression of?
High-tech, really impressive workshops, dead quiet. You walk around going, is anyone working? Yeah, they're all working on computers and things. So, you know, 60% of sales in Norway are electric, but in Oslo it's even higher than that, of course. And VW is the same. They are just focusing on electric vehicle sales. So walking around their showroom, I didn't find a combustion engine.
Wow.
Because people aren't coming in asking for them. You can get one.
Sure.
But the future is electric. They've committed, and the manufacturers are equally supportive of it. So
was that an overall impression that you got in the countries you visited, and maybe in Europe as a whole, was that people were going in and they were after EVs, they wanted to know more about
Norway than anywhere else, certainly.
Yeah.
Everywhere else, I think it's fair to say people are interested, are even positive about the notion of it, but in Sweden, as an example, like their neighbour, ultimately price is the point. If it's too expensive, they'll buy a really good combustion engine, be that an Audi or something else. But in Norway, the culture was very different, where they just can't see why you wouldn't be.
Yeah. Okay. So price, as always, is the key.
Yeah, I think again, it's about those different markets.
Yeah.
And in Norway, they do accept that it's the future. And that's not to say there's not challenges, because they've got to generate enough power and all those sorts of things as well. And electricity price increases are an issue for them.
Yeah.
For all of us, probably.
Yeah. So we have the National EV Strategy Consultation paper.
Yes.
That was released a few days ago.
Indeed it was. Pretty pleased with it.
You were? Okay.
It's short and sweet.
Yes, indeed.
Unlike government. But they seem to have the principles of the framework right. Like, they're considering everything. They're talking about incentives. They're talking about renewable energy. So it looks about right. Now, that's a consultation paper. There's no firm positions in it, so we'll all be making submissions to it. But
it was a timely visit then.
Yeah, really? For us, we couldn't have got it timed better. We're really pleased that came out, and we think, okay, we can actually influence this with evidence.
Yeah. See, one other thing I wanted to ask. I noticed also that I think you met some government representatives in the UK.
We did.
Was it just in the UK?
Yeah.
Okay. And because they're moving along, so that it must be interesting to get that government perspective as well.
Yeah, so we met with the Office of Zero Emissions, and as you'd expect, they are reasonably positive about it all. It was really interesting to see their view, and of course they are imposing regulations on manufacturers in the UK around EV targets. So that was quite different than everywhere else. And that there'll be a trading scheme. So some manufacturers who will not be producing enough EVs will be able to buy credits off other manufacturers. But if they don't ultimately meet the target, there will be significant penalties. It was quite severe per car.
Really?
Yep. So that's interesting. But they've got manufacturers. We don't have that.
Sure.
Right? But no, they are absolutely locked on to the Paris Accord and want to beat it. But they've got a lot of cars on the road, so they're looking at emissions inspections and all those other things.
Is there, in general, then going to you, obviously a very informative trip, but now you're back and you're looking back on it now. What shape do you think we're in? How do you feel about the moving forward? Again, we do seem to have a government that's more proactive in this issue. You've seen what's happening overseas. How do you feel about the whole thing now?
So I'm more positive now than I was. I went over there thinking, I just can't see how we can fix this thing in Australia, right? But as long as we're pragmatic, I think we've wasted quite a few years in Australia around positioning ourselves. So the manufacturers look at Australia and go, well, there's no national policy. Queensland's got a subsidy, New South Wales got something different, Victoria's got something. To them, it's just like, oh, this is a mess, right? So national leadership is the only way we can get there. To a lower emissions is probably the way I think about the future, and ultimately zero emission. So that consultation paper, really important. If we can land the framework right, that manufacturers sort of suddenly look across the boundary and go, this is now an interesting market, I think we can get there. So the FCAI is saying their forecast is about 18% of new vehicle sales will be electric by 2030. The government's commitment is 89%. Who has a target for 89%? Is that a weird number?
It is a bit odd.
Anyway, that aside, neither of those numbers will be true, I think. 15% is based on current, so as long as there's an intervention, I think it can go way beyond that. Can it get to 90? You wouldn't have thought so by 2030, but we just won't get enough vehicles. That whole supply problem around that, because 2030 is sort of tomorrow.
It is. Yeah.
But no, I'm far more positive about it. I think hydrogen now. I never would have thought hydrogen was a solution, but when you've got engineers in BMW saying, no, it's actually better for the car. It's better. It tells me maybe some of that will emerge. Queensland's got plenty of that stuff. So yeah, no, I can see it now. Now, what have they learnt in Europe around range? Because that's an issue for Australia. Batteries are getting better and better. Like the new Neo, Chinese-made cars, range is 1,000k.
Yeah.
You go, wow, this is now serious. Yeah. But it's 1,000k. If you drive it sensitively, you don't put your aircon on, which you can do in Europe. You don't drive. You don't get on the autobahn at 180 kilometres an hour.
Sure. Because
speed, temperature, and towing weight makes a huge difference. So if you've got a car that's a 500k range, and that's pretty average, in winter, in the dead of winter over there when it's cold, that's already 300, right? So I don't know what heat does. No one could answer that because that's not their problem over there. But heat, you'd think, might have an impact, and that's what we've got. And towing, of course, 500 becomes 200. So there's some issues we've got to work through, but this sort of change, we're pretty lucky to be in the industry during this change. It's really exciting, but my responsibility is to make sure all of the industry out there get ready. Don't just sit and think, we'll work this out later. Even though that they will. Like mechanics have been the Prius, that's bloody out there. People are fixing them. Yeah. So that's not completely new to them.
Well, that just brings me to pretty much my last question, actually. In terms of training, so we know that we've just had, or very recently had, the government sign off on the EV apprenticeship availability.
Yep.
I don't know quite if that's rolled out anywhere as yet, but it's there.
It's there, including by us, but
yes,
it's there.
Presumably they're way ahead over in Europe. Did you get any insights into the training?
Yeah. So what they focused on, they're not that far ahead. In fact, our training systems responded pretty quick, right? Having an EV qual is really impressive. So what they're finding over there, of course, is the biggest skills challenge is the current workforce.
Yes.
Right? So it's how do you upgrade them, and their model's very similar to ours. It's a skill set, it's 3 or 4 subjects in their language, competencies in ours.
Yep.
So our model's right. Our challenge is the industry sort of going, oh yeah, they're not. We'll get to that because they're not seeing them yet.
Right.
But my counsel of industry is no. Get your people trained now so they know what to do, and then we'll keep adding to it. So the EV qualification, no interest in it yet, except internationally.
Right.
A lot of people want to come here and study it. And the reason is I reckon some of the high-end dealerships, Mercedes, Audi, who will transition electric quicker, they'll start putting on electrical specialists, technicians. But apart from that, it's about how do you add to the current skill set. But of course, young people at school, we're already hearing kids saying, no, I don't want to be a mechanic. I want to be an EV repairer. All right, well, that's great. But maybe you start as a mechanic. They don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Even though you still need the skills.
Yeah. Well, that's encouraging, though, right? To know that at least on the training side of things, we're at the same level, right? We're prepped and ready to go. We just need people to go, yeah, okay, it's time.
Industry, get on board. So we've got that micro-credential. It's starting to become more popular because that's what industry wanted. But I get it. They're head down, bum up, really busy.
Yeah.
When you get home, you don't feel like studying. Certainly not, because our model here, same as TAFE, everyone comes here to train. Now, I've been into my guys saying, this is not good enough. We've got to go to them. So last week was our first course where we went to the Gold Coast and trained industry technicians in their own workshop, right, in electric vehicles. In October, I think it is, over a weekend, we're bringing 20 technicians in Toowoomba together. They're giving us the workshop, they're getting us the cars, we're sending trainers that we're going to, over a Saturday and Sunday, do a course. That's what they want. And they reckon their technicians are more than happy to do it out of hours because they can't do it in hours.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited by that.
That's great. Okay, that was our interview with Rod Camm, the CEO of MTA Queensland. Thank you, Rod, for your time today.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good fun.